back, everybody. I'm Jeff McDonald. This is Learning Plan 14, Bearing Witness. We are going to look at this, in this learning plan, at other examples of genocide that have occurred after the Holocaust, because we are not fortunate enough to believe that the Holocaust was the last of these. We're going to look at rape of Nanking. We're going to look at what happened in Cambodia, the genocide in Rwanda, and some of the current stuff that's going on in Darfur. So this is Learning Plan 14, Bearing Witness. Who never quite believed they could exist not where we were. They take us by surprise, like ugly long-forgotten memories, and like a conscience all the guns resist. And maps can really point to places where life is evil now. Nanking, Dachau. This is a poem by W.H. Auden called In Time of War, and looks at the idea that we still have places that genocide occurs, and we're not done with our work in terms of trying to create a world where tolerance and humanity exist everywhere. But one of the best things we can do is bear witness to genocide, and that's the best way to stop it from occurring. Genocide did not begin with the Holocaust, nor did it end with the Holocaust. Other examples of 20th century genocide outside of the Holocaust, Armenian genocide, have claimed the lives of an estimated 20 million people, places like Nanking, Cambodia, Rwanda, and Darfur. And we're going to kind of go through each of these and talk a little bit about them. Rape of Nanking. This is one that actually occurs just prior to the Holocaust and at the outbreak of World War II. And there were some events that led up to it. During the Japanese conquest of World War II, they invade China in 1931. First, Japan invades Manchuria. As Japanese soldiers advanced west through China, they used germ warfare, spreading typhoid fever and the bubonic plague. And then in December of 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army marches into China's capital city of Nanking and ultimately murders 300,000 out of the 600,000 civilians and soldiers in the city. So this was a terrible, terrible event that occurred in Nanking. And once again, see, it's just on the eve of World War II. World War II starts September 1939. So this is going on in Japan and China just prior to the outbreak of World War II. 6 weeks of carnage would become known as the Rape of Nanking and represented the single worst atrocity during the World War II era in either the European or Pacific theaters of war. When you think about 300,000 people killed during that month, is a terrible, terrible tragedy. Moving forward in time, 1954, Cambodia achieves full independence from France and was then ruled by a royal monarchy under Prince Sihanouk. And so this has to do with the genocide in Cambodia under Pol Pot. Who was Pol Pot? He was born in 1925 into a farming family in central Cambodia, and in 1953 joins the Communist Party. So this is in that period of time after World War II where communism is taking hold in a lot of Asian countries, a lot of these poor rural areas of Asia. And so sure enough, in Cambodia, this is what's going on. Pol Pot joins the Communist Party in 1953, and then by 1962 he'd become the leader of the Cambodian Communist Party and was forced to flee into the jungle to escape the wrath of Prince Sihanouk. In the jungle, Pol Pot forms an armed resistance movement that becomes known as the Khmer Rouge, the Red Cambodians, and they waged guerrilla warfare against Sihanouk's government in Cambodia. In 1970, Prince Sihanouk was ousted not by Pol Pot, but due to something that we did, a U.S.-backed right-wing military coup. And this is that kind of, it gets all involved in the Vietnam War. An angry Sihanouk retaliates by joining with Pol Pot, his former enemy, in opposing Cambodia's new military government. In 1970, the U.S. invades Cambodia to expel the communists from the borders, but instead drove them deeper into Cambodia, where they allied themselves with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. So because of our action, we ultimately strengthened Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. This has happened to us before, where we get involved in other countries' political wars and civil wars. And ultimately, it ends up kind of biting us in the butt because we end up doing something that makes it even worse. It happened with uh, Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan when they were fighting the Russians, and it happened here with Pol Pot in Cambodia. From 1969 to 1973, the U.S. bombed North Vietnamese communist camps in Cambodia, killing up to 150,000 Cambodian peasants. As a result, the peasants fled the countryside by the hundreds of thousands and settled in Cambodia's capital city, Phnom Penh. And all of this resulted in economic and military destabilization in Cambodia, and ultimately a surge for popular support for Pol Pot. So rather than doing what we were hoping it was going to do, which was to break up the communist regime, it ultimately strengthened them and gave people popular support for them. By 1975, the U.S. had withdrawn its troops from Vietnam, and Cambodia's government also lost its American military support, and because of that instability that we created, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge marched in Phnom Penh and seized control of Cambodia. Once in power, they began a radical experiment to create a new agrarian utopia, which resulted in the deaths of 2 million people from starvation, overwork, and executions. And so what happened in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge was also a terrible example of genocide. And we estimate now that probably 2 million people died from his campaign. Very similar to what the Nazis had done to people. They put people in camps. They put people in interrogation. They would bury them in the middle of the night in big giant pits. We found this out much later when we went back into Cambodia to look for evidence of genocide. So I guess a question I want you to think about is, does the U.S. bear some responsibility for the genocide in Cambodia? Why or why not? And think a little bit about that. You could pause the presentation if you need to and then come back. Rwanda, genocide in Rwanda. Rwanda is one of the smallest countries in Central Africa, only about 7 million people, but it's a very crowded place because it is so small. It's comprised of two main ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Although the Hutus account for 90% of the population in the past, the Tutsi minority was considered the aristocracy of Rwanda and dominated Hutu peasants for decades, especially while Rwanda was under Belgian colonial rule. This is really a very bizarre situation. Rwanda was under control of Belgium as one of the colonies, and because of their height and lighter skin, the Tutsi minority was considered to be the aristocracy. When the Belgians were there, they treated the Tutsis better than the Hutus, and ultimately gave them the impression that once Belgium left power in Rwanda, they would leave that power to the Tutsi minority to take control of the country. And really, it was almost an arbitrary designation by the Belgian people on who these people were going to be and who was better and who was worse. And basically, once you do that and designate a certain people by some external characteristic, whether it be hair color, skin color, eye color, language, religion, when you designate one group as being superior to the other, this is where you're setting the seed for genocide. Following independence from Belgium in 1962, the Hutu majority seized power and reversed the roles and oppressed the Tutsis through systematic discrimination and acts of violence. And as a result, about 200,000 Tutsis fled to neighboring Burundi, formed a rebel guerrilla army, the Rwanda Patriotic Front. Remember, the Tutsis were the ones that were promised leadership by the Belgium, but then once they left, the country erupts, the Hutus take power, and ultimately the Tutsis are forced to flee. In April 1994, amid increasing prospects of violence, the Rwandan president and the Burundi's president basically meet and hold these peace meetings with the Tutsi rebels to try to fend off some impending civil war that was coming. And sure enough, they were right. Unfortunately, on April 6, while returning from one of these meetings, the small plane carrying the two presidents was shot down by ground-fired missiles as it approached the Rwanda's airport in Kigali. And it's not real clear yet who shot them down, but once it happened, it basically sparked a civil war. Immediately after the deaths, Rwanda plunged into political violence as Hutu extremists began targeting prominent opposition figures who were on death lists, including moderate Hutu politicians and Tutsi leaders. The killings that spread throughout the countryside as the militia, armed with machetes, clubs, guns, grenades, virtually anything, began indiscriminately killing Tutsi civilians, men, women, children. No one was safe. No one was safe. It was a terrible, terrible thing. Amid the onslaught, the small UN peacekeeping force was basically overwhelmed, and there was no way they could control this. Responded to the worsening crisis. The UN Security Council responds to the worsening crisis by voting unanimously to abandon Rwanda. Their UN peacekeeping troops were pulled out, and basically the country just went into just a murderous period of time. The Hutu, now without opposition from the world community, clubbed and hacked to death defenseless Tutsi families with machetes. Using the radio controlled by Hutu extremists, they further encouraged the killings by broadcasting non-stop hate propaganda, pinpointing locations of Tutsis and hidings. It was really amazing. It was so much like the Holocaust, where they were calling them bugs, they were calling them disease, they were calling them vermin. They basically used the radio to find these Tutsis and to basically encourage people to kill them, or, make them afraid that if they didn't kill their Tutsi neighbors, that the Tutsi neighbors were going to kill them. Many Tutsis took refuges in churches and mission compounds, and ultimately these became the scenes of some of the worst massacres in the genocide. Confronted with international TV news reports depicting the genocide, the UN Security Council voted to send 5,000 soldiers to Rwanda, but basically it failed to send the troops in time to stop the massacre. And ultimately it only ends after the Tutsi rebels, who were coming in from the neighboring countries, managed to defeat the Hutus and halt the genocide in July of 1994. But between April and July, in just that little bit of time, the genocide was awful. It was just awful. Between those time periods, between April and July of 1994, over 1/10 of the population, estimated 800,000 people, had been killed. It's terrible, very terrible. If you go to a couple links in the learning plan, you'll see some links to the genocide and some people who witnessed the genocide. One of them is Immaculée. It's an amazing lady. I saw her speak here in Wausau at one point. And there's a little video that they have on there, the YouTube video, where you could see her talk about her experiences and how she had to hide during the genocide and how she was able to come out afterwards. And she makes a testimony now and speaks all over the world about the genocide. Since 2003, we've got a genocide going on in Darfur. Sudanese government soldiers and their proxy ethnic militia, known as the Janjaweed, have fought the rebel groups in western region of Darfur. So this is more recent now. In the campaign of ethnic cleansing, and you've heard that term before, targeting Darfur's blacks, the armed militiamen raped women, burned houses, tortured and killed men of fighting age. And so now this genocide is continuing in the region of Darfur. It's home to 30 ethnic groups, all African, all Muslim. The Janjaweed militias, recruited, trained, armed, supported by Sudanese government, are drawn from several small nomadic groups who claim an Arab identity. So now this is, even though they are all the same religion, same skin color, now we're going to this Arab identity versus non-Arab Muslims. They've used racial slurs while attacking and raping targeted groups who are considered to be non-Arab Muslims. The government and Janjaweed strategy has been used to carry out systematic assaults against the civilians from the same ethnic groups as the rebels, the Fur, the Zagwa, and the Masalit. And it's terrible. We've looked at different reasons. It seems like people will kill anybody for any reason now. Now it's not even religion. They're the same religion. They're the same racial group. Now it's because they're Arab or non-Arab. Rebel forces are responsible for some attacks against the civilians, but overwhelmingly it looks like the government of Sudan is responsible for this, and the Janjaweed have perpetuated this violence. Government-sponsored actions include inflaming the ethnic conflict using propaganda, impending international humanitarian access, resulting in deadly conditions of life for displaced persons, and we talked about that earlier in the class as one of the criteria, one of the conditions of genocide, that you impose a condition of life that basically is calculated to bring about a group's demise. Bombing civilian targets with aircraft, murdering and raping civilians. Ultimately, the genocide in Darfur has been terrible. There's been very little progress creating a UN peacekeeping force for Darfur. UN estimates about 2.5 million people have been displaced from their homes and have fled into neighboring countries. It's hard to find an actual number here, but the U.S. State Department estimates that anywhere between 98 and 181,000 people have died since March of 2003. And you can see just in this picture the effects of this terrible, terrible tragedy. So what can we do? Well, there's lots of different movements on there to basically learn about Darfur. This is a great website you can go to learn about the genocide in Darfur and what you can do. Some fundraising efforts by them to try to educate people on Darfur and trying to end the genocide. But probably the biggest thing is to scream. When people know about this, when people learn about this, they need to tell other people, they need to tell their politicians that we don't want this, as this thing says, not on our watch. We don't want this to be happening. And so when our children look back, they won't say the same thing to us as we say to our parents when we look at the Holocaust and say, why didn't anybody do things? Why didn't anybody do anything to stop this? Didn't anybody know what was happening? Will this be the same in children 20 and 30 years from now looking back on Darfur and asking us, why didn't you do something? Why didn't people know about this? Why didn't you try to stop this? Once again, kind of bringing in the whole idea of turning away, claiming responsibility, bearing witness. When I started the first learning plan, this was the song that I used by Pink Floyd called The Turning Away. Now that you know about this, now that you've learned about all the genocide, you've learned about the Holocaust, you learned about people's inhumanity to other people, can you really turn away? I would argue no. Now that you know that it's here, you have to be able to speak out against it. You have to be motivated. You have to be moved. You will no longer be able to tolerate injustice, whether it's in your neighborhood, in your family, in your country, or in your world. Anywhere in there where you see injustice and intolerance, you need to speak out against it to make it stop, because that's where it stops. It starts in each person. And if that's what it takes, that's what will stop injustice, intolerance, and inhumanity in other people. And that's the end of the learning plan. I'm Jeff McDonald for Tolerance and Inhumanity. There is no presentation for Learning Plan 15. It's basically just a catch-up to turn in your last PAT on how you would address intolerance and hate in our community and how you would try to establish some program to deal with that. Thank you for being in the class. I hope it was a good experience for all of you, and I hope you learned a lot. I appreciate it. Have a great day. Thank you.